It was a quiet afternoon in the mountains, where the wind gently blew through the trees and the sound of sheep bells created a serene melody. The colors of autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and orange, while light clouds floated across the blue sky. Amid this stunning scenery walked a simple man, the shepherd named Ezekiel. He was a man of few words, but with a huge heart, shaped by the long years spent caring for his flock. He lived off the wool and meat of his sheep, following a tradition that his family had kept for generations. With his tired eyes, he watched the flock graze peacefully. By his side, always vigilant, was Max, his faithful sheepdog. Max was more than just a dog to Ezekiel. He was his most loyal companion. The two shared an unbreakable bond, forged through countless journeys across the hills and valleys. Max was more than just a sheepdog. He was Ezekiel's kindred spirit, his silent shadow, the guardian of his flock and his life. That particular day, something felt different in the air. The weather seemed to change with unusual speed, and the clouds became thicker by the minute. Ezekiel knew that the weather in the mountains was unpredictable, but he had learned to trust his instincts and Max's behavior, who always seemed to know what was coming. He took a quick glance at the sky and decided it was best to lead the flock back to shelter before the weather worsened. Little did he know that this return journey would be unlike any other. As the shepherd and his dog began to descend the hills, the gentle breeze turned into a fierce gust, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Max, always alert, let out a soft growl, as if sensing something. Ezekiel furrowed his brow, but he trusted the dog. With a short whistle, he commanded the flock to move forward. Max darted skillfully between the sheep, guiding them with precision and care. However, the sheep began to grow restless as the wind intensified. The rain quickly turned into a heavy downpour, making the ground slippery. Ezekiel, using his staff, tried to control their direction, but the sheep, frightened, scattered. Max did his best to keep them together, but it was nearly impossible. Then, suddenly, a thunderclap echoed through the mountains, so loud that it seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The sheep scattered in all directions, and Ezekiel, now struggling to see through the intense rain, completely lost control of the situation. He called out for Max, but the sound of the storm drowned out his voice. The mountains, once a comforting place, now felt threatening. The dark sky and the lightning flashing across the horizon created an almost apocalyptic atmosphere. It was at that moment that Ezekiel realized just how far they were from any shelter. He turned to try to get his bearings, but everything looked different. The rain had turned the trails into rivers of mud, and the trees around him formed a curtain that obscured any sense of direction. His heart raced. He was lost. Lost in the mountains he had known since he was a boy, but now felt strange and treacherous. He called out again for Max, but the dog was farther ahead, still trying to keep the flock together. Ezekiel knew that without Max, he would be completely vulnerable in the storm. Hours passed, and the shepherd, already exhausted, began to feel the despair creeping in. The sheep were scattered, the storm seemed relentless, and darkness was quickly approaching. That was when he realized something even more dire. His body was beginning to succumb to the intense cold. The rain soaked through his clothes, and the biting wind seemed to freeze his bones. He tried to stay strong, but the fear of never finding his way back grew with every passing minute. The silence of solitude, broken only by the howling wind, made him feel more vulnerable than ever. Amid the growing darkness and the panic starting to overtake him, Ezekiel paused to catch his breath. His thoughts were scattered, and he could barely think clearly. The fear, which had been contained until now, began to overwhelm him. Would this be the end? Would this be how his story ended, lost in the mountains, with no one to find him? But beside him, Max kept fighting against the wind and the rain. The dog never hesitated, never stopped, as if he knew his owner needed him now more than ever. Max seemed to sense that something was wrong, that his human companion was about to collapse. And it was at that moment, when Ezekiel fell to his knees on the wet ground and lost all hope, that the dog looked at him differently. Max was about to do something that would change everything. Ezekiel, with a heavy heart, didn't know it yet, but the strength of his faithful friend was just beginning to reveal itself. Night was finally swallowing the landscape. The relentless rain turned the ground into mud, and every step Ezekiel took felt heavier, more difficult. His body was beginning to succumb to the exhaustion and the biting cold, and as hard as he tried to keep his head up, the fear of being completely lost in the mountains consumed him slowly. He had walked these hills for decades, knew every trail, every tree, but now everything seemed unrecognizable. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into a treacherous maze, where every sound seemed to come from an invisible danger. Max, his loyal sheepdog, ran back and forth, trying in vain to gather the scattered flock. The sheep, terrified, fled in every direction, seeking shelter, but the storm was relentless. Ezekiel knew that without Max, his chances of keeping the flock together were practically non-existent. The shepherd called out to the dog, his voice trembling with exhaustion, but Max was focused on a mission that seemed larger than anything. There was something in the dog's gaze that suggested he knew the danger wasn't just about the sheep dispersing. The storm grew worse, and with every thunderclap, Ezekiel's heart raced faster. He could no longer think clearly, and the lack of direction made him even more anxious. His survival instincts battled the exhaustion that was now taking over his body. He needed to find the way back home. He had to trust Max. But what if the dog was lost too? The thought crossed his mind like a spark of despair. If even Max, his guide and protector, didn't know the way back, what would they do? Ezekiel looked at his faithful companion, and that was when he noticed something he had never seen before. Max wasn't trying to gather the flock to lead them back to the shelter. The dog had been watching his owner the whole time, attentive to every move Ezekiel made. Max knew. He always knew. Max wasn't worried about the sheep at that moment. He was focused on something far more important. It was then that Ezekiel felt the cold touch of reality. He couldn't go on much longer in these conditions. The cold was freezing his limbs, his vision was blurred, and his strength was fading with each second. He needed to stop, needed to rest, but he knew that if he did, he might never rise again. But Max didn't stop. He ran around Ezekiel, barking loudly as if trying to get his attention, as if he knew that something bigger was about to happen. It was at that moment, with Ezekiel kneeling on the muddy ground and on the brink of giving up, that the dog looked him in the eyes with a different expression. Max, with all his intelligence and loyalty, took the lead. He ran ahead, turned to Ezekiel, and barked insistently, almost as if he was commanding him to follow. The shepherd, confused but with no alternatives, decided to trust Max entirely. He knew that alone, he wouldn't survive much longer in this storm. His only hope lay in that dog who had always been more than just a sheepdog. Max was his anchor, and now, more than ever, he was his only chance to make it home. The absolute trust that Ezekiel placed in Max was like a spark that rekindled his strength. Every step was painful, but the dog's determination guided him. Max ran through the mud and difficult terrain with the same ease as always, but now his eyes were fixed on one goal: to lead Ezekiel home. Ezekiel trudged along, and each time he seemed about to collapse, Max returned, looked deeply into his eyes, and encouraged him to keep going. It was as if the dog was pulling him emotionally, using his own strength to give Ezekiel the energy he no longer had. Night fell, and the cold grew increasingly deadly, but the shepherd pressed on, his heavy, tired feet following the invisible trail that Max seemed to see. Minutes turned into hours, and the despair that had once suffocated Ezekiel began to give way to a faint hope. Max knew what he was doing. He wasn't just an ordinary dog. There was something almost supernatural about his determination, something that seemed to transcend Ezekiel's understanding. Max wasn't just guiding him, he was saving him. Every bark, every run forward, every look he cast at his owner seemed to say, "I'm here. You're going to survive." Darkness had already consumed everything around them. Ezekiel could barely see a foot in front of him, but somehow he knew he wasn't lost anymore. Max was still there, running tirelessly, guiding him with a precision that the shepherd would never fully understand. But he didn't need to understand, he just needed to trust. As the storm continued to howl through the mountains, something within Ezekiel began to change. The fear that had once gripped his heart started to be replaced by something stronger, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Faith. The faith that even in the hardest moments, there is always a way out. Max was showing him that. His faithful companion, the one he had always considered just a dog, was proving to be much more. Max was a hero. Night had completely enveloped the mountains, shrouding everything in thick darkness. The wind howled through the pines, and the rain continued to pound the ground like nature's relentless symphony. Ezekiel could no longer feel his hands or feet. His body was so numb that he could hardly distinguish pain from exhaustion. The shepherd staggered with every step, fighting against the urge to simply give up and surrender to the storm. But Max was still there, always by his side, barking tirelessly and running ahead, guiding him. The shepherd, now completely drained, felt like he was dreaming, his feet moving mechanically in the direction Max indicated. He had placed all his trust in his dog, his life, his hope, his faith. It was as if Max had become his only connection to the real world, the only link between him and survival. At one point, Ezekiel felt his legs give way. He collapsed to his knees in the muddy ground, his vision blurring. Fatigue consumed him, and his lungs burned from the effort of breathing in the cold air. Max rushed back to him, barking desperately, as if begging Ezekiel to get up. But the shepherd was at the limit of his strength. He could barely keep his eyes open, and the relentless cold made him feel that, at any moment, his body would give out. "Max," Ezekiel whispered, his voice trembling and almost inaudible. I can't go on." Max, however, didn't give up. The dog began to lick Ezekiel's face, trying to keep him awake, trying to make his owner fight a little longer. He growled softly, biting Ezekiel's sleeve and tugging gently, as if to say, "Get up. It's not over yet." Ezekiel, his eyes closed, heard only the sound of Max's panting and the soft growl that came from the dog's chest. He felt the warmth of Max's licks on his face and knew, deep in his heart, that his faithful friend was refusing to let him give up. Max was giving everything he had to keep him alive. And somehow, Max's loyalty sparked one last flicker of strength in Ezekiel. With monumental effort, he forced his hands to press against the ground and slowly began to rise. Max, seeing his owner trying to get up, barked encouragingly, circling around him as if to say, "Yes, you can do this. We're almost there." Ezekiel, with strength he didn't know he still possessed, stood up. His body was in shambles, but his mind, revitalized by Max's persistence, now wanted only one thing: to keep going. If Max still had the strength to continue, then he needed to find his own. They walked for several more meters, with Max always leading the way, until suddenly, something changed. Max stopped abruptly, ears pricked, as if he were listening to something. He stared intently into the distance, despite the dense darkness. Ezekiel, gasping for breath, couldn't understand what was happening, but he trusted Max implicitly. If the dog had stopped, there had to be a reason. Max barked once, a strong, determined bark, and then started running in a direction that seemed completely random to Ezekiel. The shepherd, his heart pounding, followed the dog with difficulty, stumbling through the mud but determined not to lose sight of Max. He knew, in that moment, that they were close to something, perhaps the salvation he had been seeking. As they followed Max, a sound that was very familiar began to break through the cacophony of the storm. It was faint at first, but unmistakable to Ezekiel's trained ears, the sound of a distant bell. He paused for a moment, trying to discern whether it was real or just a product of his tired mind. But Max didn't hesitate. He ran with renewed energy now, as if he knew exactly where they were going. And then, through the darkness and the rain, Ezekiel saw it. A faint light, almost imperceptible, flickered in the distance, where what appeared to be a cabin stood, a refuge in the middle of nowhere. His eyes, still blurry, could hardly believe what they were seeing. It was his home. The bell he had heard was the small bell that hung on the porch, swaying in the wind. They were close. They were safe. Tears began to stream down Ezekiel's face, mixing with the rain that still fell mercilessly. He looked at Max, who had now stopped in front of him, staring back with an expression of accomplishment. The dog, who had guided his owner for hours, against all odds, had brought Ezekiel back home. But something more was about to happen, something that would leave Ezekiel speechless. With a heart full of gratitude and exhaustion, the shepherd took the final steps toward his cabin. Max walked beside him, his energy finally waning. When they reached the porch, Ezekiel collapsed to his knees, exhausted, and hugged Max with all the strength he had left. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. However, at that moment, Max let out a soft whimper and lay down at Ezekiel's feet. The dog, who had been his strength and hope throughout the journey, now seemed fragile. Ezekiel, worried, tried to lift Max, but the dog remained motionless, his eyes closed and his breathing heavy. The adrenaline that had kept Ezekiel going began to fade, and he realized, with a lump in his throat, just how much Max had pushed himself. The dog, who had given everything to save his owner, was now utterly exhausted beyond his limit. Ezekiel carried Max into the cabin. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the fireplace crackled, spreading a comforting warmth. Ezekiel laid Max down near the fire and covered him with a blanket. He knew his friend needed rest, and he also knew that the night was not over yet. The warmth from the fireplace seemed to bring a small sense of safety to the cabin, but Ezekiel's heart was still filled with worry. He knelt beside Max, who remained lying down, panting and visibly exhausted. The shepherd ran his hands over the dog's wet fur, feeling the heavy breathing of his friend, and panic began to creep into his thoughts. Max had always been so strong, so tireless, but at that moment, the dog seemed to have given more than his body could handle. Ezekiel, still trembling from the cold and exhaustion, quickly stood up and grabbed a thicker blanket to cover Max, trying to warm him. He knew he needed to do something, but isolated in the mountains in the midst of a storm, the options were limited. The silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire, filled the room with a suffocating melancholy. All Ezekiel could think about was how Max had saved his life, and now he felt powerless to save his dog's. He sat down beside Max, his face in his hands, the emotional exhaustion finally taking over. Tears ran down his cheeks uncontrollably, mixing with the mud still smeared on his face. "You can't leave me, Max. Not now. Not after everything you've done." He whispered these words, his voice trembling with desperation. It was as if all the weight of the journey and the fear he had held back for those long hours were finally crashing down on him. Time seemed to stand still, and the only sound Ezekiel could hear was Max's heavy breathing. The shepherd knew that the dog had fought beyond his limits, driven by a love and loyalty that transcended any understanding. Max had kept his owner alive, even when he himself was nearing exhaustion. The night wore on, and Ezekiel stayed by Max's side, watching every movement, waiting for any sign of improvement. He spoke softly to the dog, recalling the adventures they had shared over the years, the countless times Max had protected the flock, and how he had always known what to do, even in the toughest situations. It was as if, by talking about these memories, he was trying to reignite Max's strength, just as the dog had done for him during the storm. Finally, after hours of uncertainty, Ezekiel noticed movement. Max slowly opened his eyes, still breathing heavily, but with a spark in his gaze that had been absent. The shepherd felt such a profound sense of relief that it almost hurt. He knew that Max was still fragile, but that simple gesture was enough to rekindle his hope. "You're going to be okay, Max. I know you will," Ezekiel said, wiping away the tears that still streamed down his face. That night, the two of them fell asleep side by the fire. The sound of the storm outside seemed distant, and the warmth from the flames provided the tranquility they both desperately needed. Ezekiel, in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion, slept with one hand resting on Max's body, feeling the dog's slow, steady breathing. When the sun finally began to rise, bringing a new light to the mountains, Ezekiel awoke. The stillness of the new day was comforting, and he could hear the soft singing of birds in the distance. He got up slowly, his muscles still aching from the long journey. He looked at Max, who was now standing, still tired but clearly stronger. The shepherd smiled, his heart filled with gratitude and relief. Max had won yet another battle. He knelt beside the dog and hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of Max's body against his. "You did it, Max. You brought us back." But as he stood up, Ezekiel realized something else had changed. The time they had spent together that night had strengthened a bond that was already unbreakable. Max wasn't just a sheepdog. He was the embodiment of loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Ezekiel knew that, no matter how hard he tried, he could never repay what Max had done for him. That day, with the sky clear and the mountains covered in a light layer of mist, Ezekiel made a decision. He would never again take Max's presence for granted. The dog had proven that his role in Ezekiel's life was far greater than just guiding the flock. Max was his true guardian. As he looked toward the horizon, the shepherd knew that life would continue to bring challenges. The mountains would always be unpredictable, just like the storms that appeared without warning. But after everything that had happened, Ezekiel felt that he could face anything, as long as Max was by his side. And as the two walked out of the cabin that morning, with the flock already gathering in the surrounding fields, Ezekiel looked at Max and smiled. He knew that his faithful friend had taught him one of life's most important lessons. In the darkest moments, there will always be someone by our side, guiding us back home, even if that someone is a four-legged being with a heart bigger than the world. The days that followed were calm, as if nature had decided to reward the relentless storm with serene tranquility. The sky was clear, and the fresh mountain air seemed to bring renewal not only to the landscape but also to Ezekiel's heart. The shepherd, now much more aware of the fragility of life and the importance of the bonds we build, spent more time observing Max, who was slowly regaining his usual energy. It was as if the storm had left something deeper than fear and exhaustion, a quiet understanding of life and what truly matters. Max, with his unwavering loyalty, had become more than just the guardian of the flock. He had become Ezekiel's angel, the one who had brought him back to life when everything seemed lost. Each new day, the shepherd noticed how small gestures, like the way Max looked at him or how he followed him during daily chores, carried a much greater meaning. Max wasn't just an animal. He was the embodiment of something much larger. He represented the ability to fight even when all hope seems gone, to find strength in moments of despair, and to believe, above all, that hope should never be abandoned. Ezekiel reflected on all of this as he watched the flock graze peacefully in an open field, with Max by his side, always vigilant, but now with a sense of calm. The shepherd knew that the storm could have taken his life, but Max had not allowed that to happen. There was something almost divine in the way the dog had guided each of his steps, as if a higher force had been acting through him. The shepherd couldn't help but think of all the times over the years that he had taken Max's presence for granted. The dog had always been there, day after day, fulfilling his role without ever hesitating or complaining. But on that stormy night, Ezekiel had seen Max in a new light. The dog had proven to be much more than just a companion. He was the embodiment of true friendship, of true devotion. One morning, while they were walking together through the hills, Ezekiel stopped and looked toward the horizon. The sun was rising, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange. He knelt beside Max and placed his hand gently on the dog's head. Max, as if understanding the moment, looked at Ezekiel with those deep eyes that always seemed to understand more than words could express. "You taught me something I'll never forget, my friend," Ezekiel said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You taught me that even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. There's always someone who believes in us, who's willing to guide us back when we've lost our way. And you did that for me." Max remained still, but his eyes shone, reflecting the rising sun. The silence between them was full of meaning. Ezekiel knew that, from that day forward, nothing would be the same. He would no longer see Max as just a sheepdog, but as the savior he had been, the being who, with his purity and courage, had brought the shepherd back from the edge of the abyss. Life in the mountains continued, but something had changed within Ezekiel. Each day was lived with more gratitude, more presence, and the bond between him and Max, which was already strong, had become indestructible. The mountains, with all their beauty and dangers, now seemed less threatening because Ezekiel knew that no matter what happened, he had Max by his side, and Max had him. The story of Ezekiel and Max spread to the nearby villages. The other shepherds, who knew well the hardships of life in the mountains, were deeply moved when they heard what had happened on that stormy night. Many spoke of how special the bond between a shepherd and his dog was, but what Ezekiel and Max had experienced went beyond that. The connection between them transcended the ordinary. It was something deeper, something that touched people in a way that couldn't be explained. Time passed, but Ezekiel never forgot. Every year, around the time of the storm, he made sure to spend a night by the fire with Max, recalling the night that could have been the end, but, thanks to the strength and courage of his faithful companion, became a new beginning. He would always say, "Max brought me back. He gave me life when I no longer believed I could find my way." And as he said this, his eyes would fill with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude that could never be fully expressed in words. Max, the sheepdog, had done the impossible. He had guided his owner back home, not just physically, but spiritually as well. And that was a lesson Ezekiel would carry with him forever. True strength lies not only in the body but in the heart. And Max, with his enormous heart and incomparable loyalty, showed Ezekiel and the world what it means to love unconditionally.